Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and this is part of my series for Paper 3, looking at theories of romantic relationships. And this is the second part of that, which is equity theory. The previous video looked at social exchange. Now, the specification does actually make a difference between social exchange and equity, and they are different theories, but we find that ultimately there's equity theory does build on social exchange. So let's have a look at what it does tell us about it. So Wolster is the person who proposes equity, and he felt that equity is kind of part of real life romantic relationships, and I suppose that's the big difference. So what we need to appreciate is that Wolster kind of looked at social exchange and says people still do this. So we still have this maximizing reward and minimizing cost. But he feels that that is something which we should criticize in terms of kind of saying, well, let's have a look at this reward and cost and kind of come to something that's more real life. And so what we change here is this idea that equity theory brings in this assumption that people strive for fairness. Okay, people strive for fairness in their relationships. And if you look at kind of pure social exchange, maximizing reward, minimizing cost, surely all that I would want is for me to be looked after in terms of fed, to have all my intimate needs met, to be kind of bathed and I don't know, all the things that you could possibly imagine that would be rewarding to a person of my stature. Okay, massive TV with a fantastic PlayStation 5, can play games all day. Somebody goes out and does all the work for me and brings in the huge money and all that type of stuff. Just think of something completely ridiculous, because that's the easiest way to kind of look at how maximizing reward and minimizing cost is a bit ridiculous, because ultimately that would not be fair on my partner. She would not want to be in that situation, because she would be doing all the work and I would be basically reaping all the benefit. And so in order for a romantic relationship to work, I need to strive for this fairness, this kind of interchange between kind of cost and reward that ultimately becomes fair. And so Wolster did say that we become distressed when there is this perceived unfairness, and that becomes important to us. So the example would be, if I give a great deal in a relationship but get little in return, I will perceive it to be inequitable, and therefore I'd be dissatisfied. Okay. Now, of course, the big kind of difference here is that this is not about equality. Okay. So, for example, I might say, no, things need to be equal in terms of how much work we do, in terms of like the cooking and cleaning and all these types of things. But of course, that in itself is not necessarily fair. Classic example has been during this lockdown period, where I potentially have gone into school kind of very seldom, maybe once a week, every other week. Okay, where my wife goes in at least 2 or 3 times a week. So in those days where she's potentially in school, kind of working in a different context to me, then I would be expected to do other things. So homeschooling, helping with the cooking, helping with the cleaning, and those types of things, because that is fair rather than it being equal. Okay, so another way for us to kind of figure kind of the difference between equality and equity, we see in the first picture here, all 3 of those people have been given the same thing. However, each of their needs are different, and so therefore it's not equitable. What is equitable is potentially to change the context of what they get given, so that all 3 of them are able to experience the same joy out of watching that particular game. Okay, and so therefore that's what equity is all about. And so therefore a lot of people really like this theory in comparison to social exchange, and kind of stick with it. It's still, there's going to be concerns, of course, but of course it's quite important to us. So it is possible that each partner may contribute and receive different amounts in an equitable relationship because it's fair. As I said, I might have higher or lower needs, and therefore kind of what I receive might be different based on those particular needs. Another kind of word that we might talk about equitable is a ratio between rewards and cost. What is considered fair is a subjective assessment of the partner's perceived ratio of inputs and outputs, where previously under social exchange it was a simple linear equation of cost takeaway, so reward takeaway costs. Now we're looking at a ratio between rewards and costs. And so it could well be that this could explain some of the relationship we see, certainly where we have kind of couples where maybe one partner perhaps earns considerably more than the other person, but has a much more demanding kind of job in terms of time and things like that. So therefore there could be a give and take between, because it's a ratio, that making sure that the ratio is kind of fair within that. And so it could be that, one person maybe sacrifices elements of their career in order to accommodate the other person's career because of the financial reward that might be associated with that. And so therefore equity does seem to be something, certainly within the Western context, that is easy to understand, and we can see how potentially being fair is about right. And so it says here, equitable relationships should, according to the theory, be one where fairness changes according to the ratio. Okay, so I could find myself in a situation where ultimately I feel that it's inequitable because that ratio has kind of moved away. So if, remember, like a 1-to-1 ratio could have different kind of outputs into it. So for example, I might get 100 out of a relationship, not that that number means anything, but with a cost of 90, okay, and somebody else might put in 10 with no cost, and ultimately that could well be equitable in the fact that ultimately the ratio between the two is fair. Okay, now of course there's still an element of social exchange in this. People still do maximize their rewards and minimize their costs. So that's what goes into an equity theory. We still have a negotiated sense of understanding this is through your comparison levels and comparisons with alternatives. And so you could trade off. You could say, okay, so yes, I don't like to do this, but I will do it because of this understanding that this would be fair. We also see that this fairness or unfairness could create satisfaction or dissatisfaction that could ultimately influence the outcome of the relationship as well. So it says here, the greater the sense of perceived unfairness, the greater the sense of dissatisfaction. So this does actually imply that I could sense something to be unfair, even if it's in my advantage. I'm still could be unhappy. Kind of if I'm with somebody who's kind of being so lovely to me and I'm being so horrible, I could be unhappy as well. And then the last thing, it says that we potentially do things in order to re-establish equity if we feel that we are losing out in terms of fairness, or we find ways to restore this fairness. Okay, so that is the equity theory. This is extra stuff to kind of talk about how we practically have a look at it. So the practical use of equity theory says that, okay, so if you judge your relationship to inequitable, you might do something to restore equity. So you might start withholding sex, or you might kind of change kind of what it is that you do if you feel that you are doing too much. So you restore actual equity. But you also might actually need to talk about it. So there could be psychological equity, and maybe in a discussion of kind of what you feel that you are doing and perhaps not getting out of a relationship actually may be completely wrong. And just talking to your partner might actually make you realize, well, hang on, actually, maybe it is better than I think it is. But also there's this possibility of leaving the relationship as well. The ultimate inequitable relationship results in me perhaps stopping and leaving, and it does say actually could be divorce or just emotionally kind of not engaging in the relationship as well. So the first bit is understanding kind of what equity is, understanding the contrast to social exchange. This last bit is just the practical kind of use of equity theory that you might want to use. The evaluations for equity theory are actually very similar to social exchange. There is going to be supporting research out there, and I suppose it kind of makes perfect sense to me that if you feel that your relationship is fair and valid, you may well be motivated to stay within the relationship. So Utne looked at some relationships here, surveyed 118 of recently married couples, and basically found that couples who considered their relationships equitable were more satisfied. Okay, so this is kind of as obvious as that. If you feel that your relationship is fair, you feel kind of happy and satisfied, and it didn't matter whether they're under benefited or over benefited within the relationship. But there could well be gender differences. Now this could link to some of the concepts that we could do with culture as well. De Marais basically says that men and women perhaps perceive things differently, and what is inequitable to male might not be inequitable to female, and says women tend to perceive themselves as being more under benefited and less over benefited in relationships. Now obviously I don't kind of want to get into a gender argument here. This is just some research that kind of showed that maybe it's a perception of themselves. It says so of course what was interesting for me, it says women seem to be unhappy with being under benefited than men, and it could be that men's needs are kind of a lot more different, so therefore if they perhaps regularly kind of getting some of their needs met, they might not be unhappy, but women kind of want to have their needs met in more ways. They also looked at whether this kind of influences divorce, and basically it said that there's a greater risk of divorce for women if the woman's sense of under benefit was there. So, and this could well be an interesting factor in terms of it. As I said, if a man's perhaps needs are more basic in terms of food and sex and kind of creature comforts, if they're roughly getting those occasionally, they might be happy just to stay within a relationship, where a woman wants to be emotionally supported and emotionally kind of benefited as well. So once again, I'm trying not to be overly gender stereotypical here, but this is the research that potentially is out there. But the real concern here is if there is a gender difference, it's still not clear then what happens in terms of marital status. Will having a sense of inequity actually result in divorce? And basically, so women feel more guilty than men if they're kind of under benefited. And so altogether, all these studies do literally tell us that equity is important, but it's not clear exactly how it relates to satisfaction. So what I mean by that, so for example, equity may actually just help you understand whether you're happy or not, but it may not determine the outcome of a relationship, whether it kind of ends or not. We then, some people don't feel that equity is sufficient for romantic relationships. In fact, some people say it's a very good way to talk about kind of friendships and colleagues and other forms of relationships out there, and says it's a key determinant in relationship satisfaction. So in other words, but it doesn't explain how married people behave. As I said, if it goes back to this idea, we don't know if people get divorced because of inequity, then is it actually explaining kind of marriage relationships? And I suppose going back to kind of working in an office environment, I've said social exchange works very well in that. Perhaps in terms of fairness, in terms of equity, that's even more. I've got more incentive to try and figure something out if I have to see that person in a work context all the time. But in terms of romantic context, I might kind of be more forgiving. I might just totally have kind of a different emotional way of looking at a relationship, and so therefore that's what these people are kind of pointing towards. It says it's insufficient theory to explain marital maintenance. And it could be just down to individual differences, that some people behave in some ways and other people don't. And Huseman basically found a few things. He found these people who are called entitles or benevolence, and basically people act in different ways. So some people, these entitles, feel they deserve to get more from their partner, as opposed to somebody who's a benevolent who kind of is more prepared to invest in their relationship. And so maybe people are just different in terms of the relationship that's out there. So Clark and Mills, we kind of seen from them before, basically say we should actually differentiate the role of equity in romantic relationships with other types of relationships. So it is possible that equity, as I said, is really important, but not necessarily important for romantic relationships. So they did a meta-analysis, and they basically said that equity was often a deciding factor in non-romantic relationships, but there's a more mixed outcome when it comes to romantic relationships. So as I said, if I feel that my relationship with a colleague or with somebody that I have to work with in a different particular way, a friendship, then equity actually becomes a real issue there. But with a romantic relationship, it could actually be a bit of everything. And so ultimately, it's a limited explanation. Is kind of what all these particular points are trying to say. The very last point is similar to what I've made for social exchange, and I have to say to you quite honestly that these criticisms also apply to social exchange. That's kind of why I kind of ended with the tribal wives, but we can use both social exchange and equity are seen as these economic theories, and we can apply them to both. And we see a couple of things here saying that collectivist cultures, for example, group needs might be more important. So who cares about fairness when it's actually about other people in terms of this? And so certainly some people from individualistic cultures, for example, where the needs of the individual are more important, are kind of we can see social exchange and equity actually being kind of part of their individualistic society. In fact, you could also talk about kind of research like Lot that says that for many cultures, women are more focused on the needs of others, which I think are quite telling. So how can equity be applied to a culture where this is a particular case, where there's a socialization to women performing particular roles? So it could be that the socialization in itself could actually help us understand kind of how one's own gratification may be different in different individualistic versus collectivist cultures, and so therefore not irrelevant to some cultures. McAdam is very critical of both social exchange and equity theory, and he calls them economic theories, and he says that it only applies to Western relationships and short-term relations, so Western relationships, short-term relationships with high mobility. Okay, now that is something which obviously kind of all of us do appreciate. We are influenced by TV and social media and all these different things in terms of Western kind of ideals. Short-term relationships, okay, so in terms of even if I'm with somebody, there's that phrase that some people kind of spoke about called serial monogamy, and high mobility. Not to downplay any important romantic relationship in my life, but you could technically say that I am able to move towards another relationship quite easily in terms of my Western society. So if I'm unhappy in this relationship, I can get a divorce, I can look for another relationship, or I can seek another relationship even while in this current relationship. Not things that I personally want to do or desire for, but we can see how potentially that could be. You're going to go off to university, you're going to go to the job market, you're going to be meeting with people, you're going to have lots of choice in terms of partners. You might feel, oh, you struggle to find a romantic relationship, but you ultimately do. But in contrast, once again, I'd recommend you look at some of the tribal wives. If you live in a remote village and there's only one eligible person, for marriage, and it's actually about children rather than about kind of whether you're happy or not. You might happily marry somebody for that particular context. So there could be other factors that could rate into it. McAdam is very critical of all these types of theories, these Western theories. So it says reflects characteristics of individualistic societies. And so therefore profit and loss in itself is actually something which is not relevant to all cultures. So it says therefore equity theory, and we could say social exchange, is a poor reflection of relationships across all cultures. So it could, and if you are unconvinced by this, look at kind of maybe the success rate of arranged marriages. Look at kind of how other cultures might view kind of what the purpose of marriage may be, and trying to take off those blinkers of the Western society that we might exist in. So I hope that you did enjoy this. I know that I've kind of spoken quickly. I'm trying to get through the content in order to explain kind of theories to you. I love these two theories. They're very kind of nice to kind of explain and both to be critical of as well. But there we go, social exchange and equity theory. I hope you're keeping strong, keep well, look after each other, take care, and I'll speak to you soon.